The battle that nearly changed the outcome of World War II. June 4, 1942. The Pacific Ocean looked calm. Far beneath the surface, however, two enormous fleets were moving toward one of the most important battles of the Second World War. American aircraft carriers were waiting. Japanese aircraft carriers were approaching. Thousands of sailors and hundreds of aircraft were about to enter a battle that would change the balance of power in the Pacific. The battle would become known as the Battle of Midway. Only 6 months earlier, Japan had launched its attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack shocked the United States and brought America fully into the war. Japan had hoped to weaken the American Pacific Fleet and create enough time to build a powerful defensive perimeter across the Pacific. But Japan's leaders knew that the United States possessed enormous industrial strength. If the war continued for years, American factories could produce ships, aircraft, and weapons on a scale Japan would struggle to match. Japanese planners therefore wanted another decisive victory. They wanted to destroy more American aircraft carriers. They believed Midway Atoll could help them achieve that goal. Midway was a small American-controlled island located roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. It was strategically important because of its location. If Japan captured Midway, it could strengthen its position in the Central Pacific and threaten Hawaii. The Japanese plan was complicated. A large Japanese fleet would approach Midway. Aircraft would attack the island. Then, when American forces responded, Japanese carrier aircraft would strike the American fleet. The plan depended on surprise. Japanese commanders expected the Americans to react after the attack began. But there was one problem. The Americans already knew something was coming. American codebreakers had been working to understand Japanese naval communications. They discovered enough information to determine that the Japanese were planning a major operation against a location identified by the Japanese as AF. American intelligence officers suspected that AF was Midway. To confirm the theory, the Americans sent a message from Midway saying that the island had a problem with its water supply. Japanese communications soon reported that AF had a water shortage. The Americans now knew Midway was the target. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, began preparing an ambush. American aircraft carriers were positioned northeast of Midway. The carriers USS Enterprise, USS Hornet and USS Yorktown became central to the American plan. The Americans had fewer carriers than the Japanese force approaching Midway. But they had something extremely valuable. They had information. On June 4th, Japanese aircraft launched from 4 carriers. The carriers were Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The first Japanese attack targeted Midway itself. American defenders fought back. The Japanese aircraft inflicted heavy damage on the island's facilities. But they did not destroy Midway completely. The Japanese commander now faced a difficult decision. A second attack on the island might be necessary. But aircraft carriers had another problem. Aircraft could be armed with different weapons depending on the mission. Bombs could be used against land targets. Torpedoes could be used against ships. Changing the weapons took time. And while Japanese crews were preparing their aircraft for another mission, American carriers were searching for the Japanese fleet. The Americans had launched reconnaissance aircraft. They knew the Japanese were somewhere nearby. But finding them was not easy. The Pacific was enormous. Thousands of square miles of ocean separated the opposing forces. Then an American reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Japanese fleet. The American carriers immediately prepared their strike aircraft. Several waves of American aircraft headed toward the Japanese carriers. The first attacks did not go as planned. Torpedo bombers found the Japanese fleet but suffered devastating losses. Many American aircraft were shot down. Others failed to hit the Japanese carriers. For a time, it appeared that the Japanese fleet might survive. Then something extraordinary happened. American dive bombers arrived at almost exactly the right moment. The Japanese carriers were in a vulnerable position. Aircraft were being prepared. Fuel and ammunition were on the flight decks and inside the hangars. The Japanese carriers had aircraft that needed to be launched. Others were being rearmed. The situation was chaotic. American dive bombers attacked. Bombs struck the Japanese carriers. The results were catastrophic. Akagi was hit. Kaga was hit. Saria was hit. 3 of Japan's 4 major carriers were burning. Within minutes, a large part of the Japanese carrier force had been devastated. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived the initial attack. Japanese aircraft from Hiryu later found the American carrier Yorktown and attacked it. Yorktown was badly damaged. But American forces continued searching for Hiryu. Later that day, American aircraft found the Japanese carrier. Hiryu was attacked and eventually destroyed. 4 Japanese fleet carriers had been lost. The Battle of Midway was not over immediately. Fighting continued around the island and across the Pacific. But the destruction of the 4 Japanese carriers represented an enormous strategic defeat. Hundreds of experienced Japanese naval aviators were also lost. This mattered enormously. Aircraft carriers could be replaced eventually. Experienced pilots were much harder to replace. Japan had lost some of its most important naval aviation strength. The United States had also suffered losses. The carrier Yorktown was severely damaged and eventually sank after being attacked again. American aircraft and pilots were lost during the battle. But the balance had changed. Before Midway, Japan had been expanding across the Pacific. After Midway, that expansion began to slow. The Japanese military could no longer rely on the same level of carrier superiority. The battle also demonstrated the enormous importance of intelligence. The Americans had not won simply because they had more weapons. They had gained a crucial advantage by discovering the Japanese plan. Knowing where the enemy would be allowed American commanders to position their carriers for an ambush. This was one of the most important lessons of the battle. Information could be as powerful as firepower. The Battle of Midway also revealed the growing importance of aircraft carriers. The opposing fleets rarely fought each other directly with battleship guns. Instead, aircraft traveled hundreds of miles over the ocean and attacked ships from the air. The carrier had become the center of naval warfare. Aircraft could search enormous areas of ocean. They could attack enemy ships before the ships were close enough to see one another. The battle was therefore a preview of the future of naval warfare. But the consequences went beyond military technology. Midway changed the strategic direction of the Pacific War. Japan still controlled enormous territories. The Japanese military remained powerful. The war was far from over. But the opportunity for continued rapid expansion had been damaged. The United States could now begin using its industrial power more aggressively. American shipyards began producing enormous numbers of ships. Factories produced aircraft, tanks, ammunition, and other military equipment. The United States had entered a war that would eventually become a massive industrial struggle. Japan faced a much more difficult situation. The loss of 4 carriers and many experienced pilots could not easily be reversed. The Japanese Navy would continue fighting. But the strategic advantage it had enjoyed after Pearl Harbor was gone. In the months after Midway, American forces began pushing back. The next major stage of the Pacific War would include the campaign for Guadalcanal. American forces would begin taking the initiative. The war would still last for more than 3 years. There would be enormous battles. Thousands of ships and aircraft would be destroyed. Millions of people would die across the wider conflict. But Midway marked a major turning point. It demonstrated that Japan could be defeated. Before the battle, Japan's rapid victories had created the impression that Japanese forces might dominate the Pacific. After Midway, that confidence was badly damaged. The battle also showed how quickly the situation could change. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese commanders believed their fleet was conducting a powerful offensive. Hours later, 3 of their major carriers were burning. By the end of the battle, all 4 Japanese carriers had been lost. The difference between victory and disaster had been measured in hours. That is what makes Midway such a remarkable battle. It was not simply a clash between 2 fleets. It was a battle of intelligence, timing, aircraft, courage, and decisions. A single reconnaissance sighting could change the plan. A few minutes could determine whether aircraft were ready to attack. A single bomb could ignite fuel and ammunition. And one successful strike could destroy a carrier that represented years of construction and training. The sailors and pilots involved in the battle did not know how history would remember them. American pilots flew into enemy defenses knowing they might not return. Japanese pilots launched attacks knowing that American fighters were waiting. Sailors remained aboard burning ships trying to control fires and save their comrades. Many never came home. The battle therefore had a terrible human cost. Behind the strategic maps were real men. Young pilots. Engineers. Mechanics. Sailors. Radio operators. Commanders. Every one of them faced danger. Some survived to fight another day. Others disappeared beneath the Pacific. Today, Midway Atoll is quiet. The ocean surrounding it looks peaceful. It is difficult to imagine that this remote location once became the center of a battle that changed the direction of a global war. But the history remains. The Battle of Midway demonstrated that the Japanese advance could be stopped. It gave the United States an important strategic advantage. And it forced Japan to fight a war in which the balance of industrial power increasingly favored America. Midway did not end World War II. It did not guarantee an Allied victory. The war would continue for years. But it changed what was possible. Japan had entered the war hoping to create a powerful position in the Pacific. After Midway, it had to defend what it had gained. The initiative was beginning to move toward the United States and its allies. That shift would eventually become one of the defining developments of the Pacific War. The Battle of Midway is therefore remembered not because it was the largest battle of World War II. It was not. It is remembered because of what happened in a few critical hours. 4 Japanese carriers were destroyed. Experienced pilots were lost. American forces survived despite serious casualties. And the strategic balance of the Pacific changed. The battle proved that intelligence could defeat surprise. It proved that aircraft carriers had transformed naval warfare. And it showed that a seemingly unstoppable military advance could suddenly be stopped. On June 4, 1942, the Pacific War entered a new phase. The Japanese fleet had been damaged. The American fleet had survived. And the war that once seemed to be moving rapidly in Japan's favor was beginning to turn in another direction. The Battle of Midway did not decide the entire Second World War. But it helped decide who would control the initiative in the Pacific. And for that reason, the quiet waters around a tiny island became the setting for one of the most important battles in modern history.